Hi, my name's Emma Bartlett. I'm a partner at CM Murray, and I'm joined today by some fantastic experts in this area to record a short podcast, which is intended to be a snapshot of the panel discussion held at this year's International Forum of Senior Executive Advisors in London in June this year. And actually, Teresa Johnson, who is one of the participants today, was a fantastic panel chair, as I was unable to attend due to COVID. So my great thanks to Terry. And luckily, with this podcast, I get to pretend to be panel chair in this. So I'm joined today by Pål Kvernaas, who's a partner at Haavind Law Firm in Norway, specialising in employment and pension law. Teresa L Johnson, partner at Arnold Porter in San Francisco, who advises clients on corporate and finance matters and has a particular focus on board diversity as part of her corporate governance work. Wendi Lazar, partner at Outten Golden in New York, specialising in employment and executive compensation, advising clients and attorneys in the US and abroad as part of her international practice. And Carl-Frederik Hedenstrom, partner at CFH Stockholm, again specialising in employment law. So the panel in June looked at the different approaches taken internationally towards greater diversity on boards, assessing what had worked well, what could be improved, and what the next steps for board diversity are, all of which we will seek to discuss in this much shorter podcast and the panel discussion. Personally, I think the big question is what is going to change board diversity and bring about the improvements that I think it's a common assumption are required. The imposition of legislation is resulting in either constitutional and legislative challenges or in some cases stagnation. And the most productive output, I think, from our panel discussion today is to get to the bottom of that question. We'll also be discussing the impact of shareholder activism, reverse activism, executive pay and ESG, which are all up for debate. But first, I'd really like to turn to Pål and ask my first question. Thank you so much for joining us, Pål.
Welcome.
You've had 16 years of experience of mandatory board diversity quotas in Norway. Could you just give us a brief overview of what they are and how these quotas affected board diversity in Norway?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Happy to talk about the Norwegian situation. And you can just imagine that we were pretty proud of ourselves when we were kind of like first country out, 2005, 2006, implementing these quotas for public limited companies in Norway. And what we implemented was actually pretty hard requirements, stipulating that every board need to be at least 40% women. We had deadline for each company to accomplish that requirement. And we had hard sanctions, meaning that if you did not meet the quotas within the deadline, you would actually be liquidated as a company. So no wonder every company actually fulfilled the requirements for the quotas within the deadline. But we had some challenges with it. So that was one thing I'm happy to talk about. And also, of course, did we eventually get the effect out of it? But at the beginning, we obtained the target of getting the 40% pretty quickly, actually.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, you really did lead the way in that respect. But you mentioned difficulties there. What are, in particular, were the difficulties faced by Norwegian boards?
Well, this is a little bit embarrassing to admit as a Norwegian. One of the challenges was actually of a practical sort. The boards and the nominating committees for the board members actually found it difficult, at least within some branches, to find what they believe will be sufficiently qualified women actually on the top levels of the Norwegian business life. So many boards had to kind of expand their search for qualified candidates outside of Norway, leading up to a lot of the boards being populated by women from the Nordic countries, and especially from Sweden and Norway, together, of course, with most of them being from Norway. And this was actually to the extent that at the beginning, at the early years of this, we even got the expression golden skirts, because we had a few female professional board members that populated many of these boards around. So it was a peculiar situation where we are happily not there now, of course, but this was actually a practical situation back in 2006.
I think it's that was a practical situation which was experienced certainly in the UK when board diversity started to kick off. But whilst we're talking about challenges, I'm going to go to Terry, actually, because I know that California has had much more recent experience of imposing quotas on boards. And it would be really great just to hear how the imposition of quotas impacted the progress of board diversity. And I will ask you, Terry, a follow-up question as well, because there have been difficulties experienced in boards meeting those quotas as well, which are a little bit more extensive than just gender. So Terry, hi.
Hello. It's good to be together again and to be talking about this incredibly important topic. So perhaps to set the stage, in California, beginning in 2018, we instituted legislation that was designed to improve board diversity, which established in 2018 mandatory requirements for gender. In other words, a minimum number of women directors on corporate boards of publicly traded companies headquartered in California. And then later in 2020, a similar law was adopted that requires a minimum number of directors from underrepresented communities, which is defined to mean minorities and people identifying as LGBTQ+, on similarly the boards of companies that are publicly traded and headquartered in California. And from the time that these statutes were adopted, it was expected that there would be legal challenges to them. We've seen an enormous increase in the number of women on board since the California requirement was adopted. The number of women on boards of California-based public companies has nearly tripled. So essentially, notwithstanding the expected controversy and challenges to the law, it has had a significant effect. Less so with respect to the underrepresented communities requirement. It has been more successful in terms of bringing more white women onto publicly traded boards of California headquartered companies. We've seen less progress on that front, although I think that's continuing to improve. So as I said, both the California laws and as Wendi will probably speak about in a little bit, the NASDAQ requirements are being challenged in the courts, and the lower courts have struck down the California requirements. They're currently on appeal. But the basic concept is that they were struck down based on violating the Equal Protection Clause. And what that means is that under constitutional jurisprudence, the state has to show that a law that makes a distinction on the basis of race or gender has to fulfill a compelling state interest. Showing a history of discrimination can be a sufficient justification for such a law. In fact, that's the basis for affirmative action, which is also, P.S., getting challenged. But interestingly, the lower court in the California cases took the position that the legislature had looked at the demographics of board directors relative to the population at large and noticed that there was a very disproportionate number of white men on boards. But the court looked at it and said, well, really what you should have looked at was the demographics of sitting board directors relative to the pool of board candidates. And there's an inherent challenge in that, given that the recruitment of board directors is not a process where there's some kind of cattle call application where you can easily identify a pool of applicants. It's much more informal and much more network based. Interestingly, that kind of approach works well for affirmative action, where in fact you do have a pool of applicants who are submitting their applications, but not so much for boards. The lower court then in the California case has also noted that the lack of diversity on boards could be the result of benign cultural differences. And finally, the state had sort of indicated that they had a compelling interest in more diverse boards because more diverse boards deploy more inclusive workplace standards and have been linked to stronger corporate performance. But the court took the position that that wasn't enough, that the state does not have a compelling enough interest in healthy businesses, that's not sufficiently specific or immediate. And I'll note also that interestingly, the same individual who is challenging the California board diversity requirements and also the NASDAQ board diversity requirements is also the one challenging the affirmative action requirements in the case involving Harvard that's in front of the Supreme Court. And his name is Edward Blum, and he's a well-known conservative activist.
Thank you for taking us through that. I mean, we've got Norway on the one hand with regulation that's been in place for a long time that wasn't easy to fulfill but did get fulfilled. We've got California on the other hand with regulation which created a lot of change over quite a short period of time, but again in this case challenged, which was a huge difficulty in that respect. And I'll come to Wendi shortly to discuss the broader issues with regards to the NASDAQ regulation and other challenges. But in the UK, we're sort of sitting in the fence, sitting on the fence with this. There has been very little in regulation in the UK in this regard at all. Reliance, as with a lot of employment legislation at the moment in the UK, to be fair, is placed on peer pressure, naming and shaming, trying to get employers to do the right thing without risk of penalties which may or may not be enforced. And so we've had aspirational targets set, and this was set more than 10 years ago to get 30% women on boards, and it's gone through a great deal of review. The review has analysed what is bringing about change, and one of the things actually that was brought out as part of the Hampton-Alexander review was a very similar comment to the one that you mentioned, Paul, where boards were saying, well, there just aren't enough women to assist with us meeting our target, or all the good women are taken, or we've got our one female director, leave us alone, we've done our job. So there was a lot of that to start off with, and I would say very much over the last 5 years that attitude has changed, and there is now a push in the UK as well to increase diversity on boards beyond gender. The latest review being driven in financial services, and in particular in the FTSE 350, is to increase diversity up to 40%, but there are some specific targets having been set. And in April this year, there was also the certain listed companies now have to comply with an obligation to meet specific board diversity targets, or otherwise explain why they can't meet them. And the naming and shaming in this respect is what is driving. Nobody wants to be in trouble in that respect and not being able to meet the FCA objectives that are being set. Again, it's not for all listed companies, it's just for certain listed companies. Wendi, I'm really interested to hear about what's happening obviously in other parts of the US, and wondered if you could please comment on trends that you've seen in support for quotas, or at least the NASDAQ approach to improving board diversity.
Until really 2018 in the US, we weren't really seeing any legislation around board quotas or transparency and disclosure rules going into state law. And so 2018 in California was definitely the pivotal event. As usual, California is way ahead of the rest of the country on these issues. And we did see what followed after California was New York, Washington, Illinois, I believe a couple of other states. And I think that that legislation is slightly different. They took a very different approach, and maybe a smarter approach. We may all wind up at the same place, but the approach was more about disclosures as opposed to rulings that you had to comply in very specific ways to fulfill a pipeline that would get you a quota by a certain period of time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and what that makeup had to be. And so New York is ongoing. It's more statistically based evidence of showing what Teresa says was kind of what California was accused of leaving out in their legislation, which was really finding the demographics and really proving that they were using the right groupings to really put their finger on what was wrong with the existing board of directors at public companies. And so you see much less aggressive legislation in these other states. And subsequently, as far as I know, there haven't been any major challenges to that legislation as yet. I would say the NASDAQ appeal, which is very interesting, but very much in line with California. As Teresa noted, it is the Alliance for Fair Board Recruitment group, a conservative, I use the word think tank lightly, loosely, but they are a group that is fighting affirmative action in the United States and certainly fighting regulatory approaches and quotas. One of the big issues, besides the equal protection argument, which we certainly have heard, and even a kind of, I will say, shameless argument that you can't discriminate against white straight men. Very interesting. I never thought they were in a protected class, but I guess now they are. Hasn't been my experience as an employment lawyer, but certainly it's an interesting argument. The other arguments they're making, though, are, that there really is no business case for this quota idea. Then they're also making the case that that the SEC that approved NASDAQ's regulations to begin with, which happened in February 22, so we talked about that obviously before, but these regulations, again, were very specific. You had to comply with the NASDAQ rule if you wanted to be listed on the NASDAQ exchange. You had to have a certain amount of women, minorities, LGBTQ plus directors on your board by a certain period of time. And again, this was approved by the SEC. And it's interesting because NASDAQ is not really a government body. What's interesting is the challenge when they brought the appeal NASDAQ, not NASDAQ, but the Alliance for Fair Board Recruitment brought this appeal to the Fifth Circuit. What's interesting about it was that they were claiming that there was not even a procedural right for NASDAQ to have this ruling, and it shouldn't have been approved by the SEC, which is a government agency, and that they had no right. They overstepped their bounds. They were applying a very, the Equal Protection Clause wouldn't allow for this, and so they were really absolutely that challenge was made. And I think that as good lawyers, we have to look at that, because certainly SEC does have regulatory authority with this rule to sanction companies that don't comply or explain. So it is an interesting issue just on a legal front from both sides.
It's interesting you mentioned on the protection for the white male group. We've seen some challenge in the UK. Terry mentioned positive affirmation, or in the UK positive action, and there have been some challenges in the UK in that respect as well. But to be fair, I think quite often people can not understand necessarily the distinction, and it is a fine line between positive affirmation, positive action, and positive discrimination, the latter being unlawful. And as a result of overstepping the mark with positive action, you move into the realms of positive discrimination, and then there is a group of people who are going to be adversely affected by organizations or boards who are trying to push through diversity targets, irrespective of whether or not they're still going to be appointing people on merit. And I can see where comes from. Wendi, I have another question, but before I do, I'd really like to hear from Carl-Frederik, bringing the discussion back to Europe. Can you just quickly summarize for us Sweden's approach to board diversity, including how it responded to the recent EU directive, obviously approving women on boards?
First of all, I think this sort of discrimination discussion regarding straight white men is kind of interesting, because I usually use it as an example when I teach that it's not possible. You know, I can't be, since you can't see me now because it's a podcast, but I'm a straight, middle-aged, white, sort of well-educated person. I find it very hard to understand how anyone could discriminate against me. So that's a very interesting sort of angle to this. Secondly, I also made the sort of, I was listening to the description from the US, and it's kind of interesting how much litigation all this sort of legislation will bring up, because in Sweden, if you have legislation, it's hardly ever appealed. You know, you can't really appeal it to court. We don't have a constitutional court in that way. So if the government enacts a law, that's it, unless it's sort of very, very wrong. You know, it has happened that you went to the European Court, but you don't litigate legislation like that usually. But anyway, we're in a sort of an interesting situation, because just a couple of weeks ago, or a month ago actually, the European Commission finally agreed on a directive for board diversity. And it's pretty similar, I think, Paul, to what Norway did, you know, 15, close to 20 years ago. It certainly has the same aims, you know, 40% of the women on boards, or as the directive says, it doesn't say women, it says the sex with the least representation on the board should at least be 40%, to make it sort of gender neutral, even if everyone knows what we're talking about. It also makes a distinction between board members with a management position and non-management positions. So it's 40% if you count all board members. If you count board members that do not have a management position, it's 33% if you count all board members. So we'll see what happens with this. 2026 is sort of the deadline for fulfilling the requirements. Sweden has been a staunch, I would hope, champion of this, but on the contrary, we've been totally against all these measures, and voted against it, I think, together with Slovenia and Poland or something like that. So I'm not going to come into what sort of government we have right now after the elections. That's sad enough, but it will probably not anyway be positive for these sort of issues. The reason we voted against it was that we have a company code in Sweden, which is it's not legislation, it's a sort of a code of conduct for listed companies. And for the last 20 years, that has included a section saying that companies should strive to have an equal board, 50-50 that is. And so there's some carrots, but not many sticks in this legislation, so to speak. Regardless of that, as of present, we have like 39.6% women on the boards of listed companies. So we're almost there. And I think that politicians will say, you know, we don't have to do anything about the new directive because we already fulfill the requirements. So we'll just sit still and do nothing pretty much. The main argument against legislation is that, you know, this will infringe on the shareholders' prerogative to pick the most qualified board. And it's nothing that you can do by legislation, because you cannot force shareholders to vote in a certain way. Because at least in Sweden, the shareholders pick the directors. And as a shareholder, you can vote whatever way you want. Secondly, we also have labor representatives on the boards, and they are picked by the unions. So that will make it sort of complicated in Sweden, at least, to sort of have this sort of regulations, because if you have a big shareholder and that person votes against an equal board and that decision goes through, it's kind of hard to punish the company for that. It's not the company's decision, and the company cannot do anything about really who owns them. So that's sort of the main argument. So in short, we're still ranked number 5 in the world when it comes to board diversity. So I think that our politicians would probably say that, well, EU directive or not, we sort of adhere to this anyway, so we're not going to do anything. We're going to sort of keep on do business as usual.
That's so interesting. And with regards to the composition of women holding the board positions as opposed to the non-critical positions in Sweden, it sounds like you've made significant progress in that respect, because in the UK, where people have been striving to meet what is a voluntary target, it's been quite easy to fill the, for example, the non-executive roles, or the, not the chairman, not the CEO, not the what are seen as core decision-making elements of it. So I'm really interested to hear from Sweden's perspective, and also interested to get your views on whether the diversity on board goes beyond gender. Is there diversity in company leadership generally as well within Sweden?
I would say it's probably the same thing as with many other places. I've been trying to get, up-to-date figures on this, but my general feeling is that when you come to sort of management level, you're going to see it's a pretty dramatic decrease in the numbers. It's not going to be 40%. It's probably going to be around 20. And I'm saying this without sort of having any sort of scientific basis for it. Just I've just sort of sifted through articles and trying to figure out, where we're at. But we're not really there yet. It's still a male club when it comes to the CEO level. When it comes to other diversity, we have a huge problem, and that's not only with boards. That's society in general. When it comes to especially groups that are new in Sweden, I'm not going to talk about the LGBTQ plus movement, because I think we're handling that fairly well anyway. We don't have any statistics on it really when it comes to boards, but when it comes to migrants or first or second generation, they're, with a few notable examples, they're not in the boardroom at all. So that is a problem. You have 2 million people here with very little representation in corporate Sweden, really, in that sense, since 20% of our population are first or second generation migrants. So that's something that I think we're going to have to work with going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I'm interested that you talked about shareholders appointing directors onto boards. Obviously, in the UK, we have investor directors, but generally the company themselves are free to choose their own directors. But Wendi, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, because where there isn't regulation and there's a voluntary targets, where do you find the pressure is coming from for change, for better diversity on boards?
I think it's been a really interesting time. I mean, we're living through social movements that have really had a huge effect on bringing attention to the issue of diversity as a whole, and secondarily, obviously, to who's running the corporations and who serves on their boards. And the Black Lives Matter movement certainly catapulted a tremendous amount of change that resulted in women of color, people of color serving on boards more than certainly they had in the past. I think in 2021, it was something like 535 Black women were put on boards throughout the country. That's a huge number and a huge change. It's a game changer. It's not enough, but it's a game changer. I think the Me Too movement also really focused a lot of energy on how women were being treated in the corporate world, and that catapulted boards to wake up and take notice. But I think on the business side, DEI has become very embedded in the ESG process as a whole. And it is definitely the S, the social middle piece of ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues that companies have become acutely aware of, not necessarily voluntarily. They have activist investors that have really held their feet to the fire and made sure that the issues that are important to them in terms of climate change, climate control, DE&I governance issues in general are being addressed by the companies on the boards that they serve. And you know, you used to have an occasional activist investor, like in the newspaper. Now I think it's a daily event. Every board sees an activist person and is learning how to cope and deal with that. At the same time, you are looking at DEI programs that are actually feeding now, I think finally, pipelines, as Teresa had addressed before. It's not happening on the golf course anymore where, you know, a guy says to his buddy, you'd be great on my board. You know, you have all the experience, plus you're a terrific golfer. You should really join my board. That is, of course, still happening, but I think the boys' club for board membership is not quite the same anymore. And I think that, you know, that you're seeing throughout the country in areas where there aren't a lot of diverse and minority candidates for board positions. Recruiters and companies are going out of their comfort zone to try to find those folks, to build pipelines, and to really enable the picture to change. And so, you know, the other piece I will just say that I think is really interesting is this generational shift in general. You just don't have consumers and investors that are just willing to put up with the status quo. Women consumers are fighting pretty hard on the investment front to invest in companies that make sense for them, and to have those companies make good business judgments in terms of recognizing that there are women stakeholders, there are LGBTQ stakeholders, there are Black stakeholders, and they've got to do that to run a good business. It's not just DE&I. I think ESG has captured what is really a business imperative. If you want the market, if you want to broaden that market and you want to develop that market, you need to have a diverse group, a diverse company, and people who are leading that company at the top who are diverse executives.
I think that makes perfect sense, and thank you for taking us through that. I have one last question, which I'm going to put to Pål and Terry, and I don't mind who answers it first. But irrespective of whether there is legislation or legislative requirement, to have a particular diversity on boards, what would you say has had a good influence on increasing board diversity in your experience? Or perhaps another question in that respect is, do you agree that there is evidence that better diversity on boards increases productivity, profitability, aids better board decision making? Terry, Pål, which of those questions would you like to answer?
So with respect to the pressures to increase diversity on boards, and this is something that Wendi alluded to as well, there's enormous focus from the institutional investor community on getting more diversity on boards. The large institutional investors in the US, like BlackRock and State Street, have announced voting policies that essentially say they will withhold votes from companies from supporting boards of directors that don't have sufficient diversity. The large investment banks like Goldman Sachs have taken a position that they will not take companies public that don't have sufficient diversity. So there's a lot of pressure from the big influential, if you will, power players in the market broadly pushing in that direction. Interestingly, now what we're seeing as part of what I'd call the in air quotes anti-woke movement is somewhat of a pushback against some of those things, and that's coming from a number of what we'd consider red states. We're seeing initiatives on the part of Texas and Florida, for example, pushing back on ESG focused investments. I think that there was a group of 19 attorneys general from conservative states that filed a brief in the NASDAQ case challenging the NASDAQ rule. So I think we're seeing that pushback, and it's going to make it interesting for companies to figure out how to navigate that process. I think with respect to the benefits of having more diversity on boards, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of studies that show a correlation between having more diversity on boards and stronger performance. But one of the things I think that has come out as these things have been litigated is that it's so hard to show causation. And one of the things that came up in the California cases and also was essentially kind of, you know, admitted by the SEC in the NASDAQ case is that they can't, to a kind of rigorous standard, prove causation, prove that diversity causes better results. There's a lot of studies that show correlation, and I think a lot of us believe in our hearts that it's better, but it's difficult to meet that standard.
Thank you. And Paul,
Yeah,
do you have any additional?
and to follow up, we have 60 years of experience with board representation, 40% women in our boards for listed companies, and what are the results? Because this was the whole point of having the quotas, right? To get results, and surveys shows that everybody who is in a more diverse board agree. There's a huge consensus that they agree that the board decision making is better with a diverse board. But do we see the results from that, as Terry just mentioned? And the Norwegian service, or the surveys about the Norwegian situation, does not show that those companies are more profitable than other companies. So we do not have that evidence that the quotation actually has that effect. But that is one thing. The other thing that was perhaps even more important is that we wanted to, or we expected to have what we call a trickle-down effect from greater diversity in the board would mean greater diversity on CEO level and greater diversity on executive level. But we have no more CEOs, female women CEOs now than when we started with this. We do not have more representation of female executives, except for the last years. But we are pretty certain that that is not related to the quota. It's related to the change in society more general. We do not have the same kind of push from investors and shareholders as I hear from the States. And I think that this is really, really interesting, because at the end of the day, I think that will be what will actually cause more effect for the companies rather than legal requirements as we have in Norway.
Thank you. I think if nothing else to take from this, that there is so much experience across the world, which is from which we can all draw from to bring about the change in board diversity, and undoubtedly from the conversations that we've had, that this is something which will continue irrespective of legislation. It seems to me that the big push though really needs to be getting the diversity in the levels just below board levels, so that the pipeline is increased, and we don't have the need for somebody to stand up and say, we need, what are we going to do to get this next person on the board who's going to be representative of the world in which we run our markets. I'm incredibly grateful for all of you for your time in providing and contributing towards this podcast, and I hope we've all found it useful, and I hope the listeners will find it useful as well. So until the next IFSEA, which is coming up. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.